I'm John Hinneberger of Texas Housers, and welcome to part 2 of the course, Attacking the Roots of Injustice. As people dedicated to justice in homes and neighborhoods, it's our responsibility to figure out how we can have the biggest impact. This means using our time, energy, and resources efficiently. Lesson 1 showed us there are an overwhelming number of inequalities we face in homes and neighborhoods. Far too much to take on. But what if we could organize our work to take on the underlying root causes of these multiple injustices? Now that would let us have a big impact. The first root cause is discrimination that people experience in their homes and neighborhoods. Primarily, this is discrimination against people because of their race or national origin. Discrimination that limits the choices of people of color in their homes and neighborhoods. Over many decades, discrimination ends up segregating, which means concentrating, poor people and people of color in just a few neighborhoods. These areas get ignored by government. Neighborhood segregation permits government officials to discriminate even more by withholding infrastructure and public services from these segregated neighborhoods. So it's a vicious cycle. One Texas civil rights lawyer pointed out that local governments always put what he calls the bad stuff, that is, dumps and polluting industries and other stuff people don't want to live near. They put those things in neighborhoods of color. But at the same time, local governments put the good stuff, like good stormwater drainage to keep neighborhoods from flooding, complete networks of sidewalks, well-maintained streets, quality commercial districts, all that type of good stuff isn't often provided to segregated neighborhoods of color where residents are living on low incomes, but it ends up in higher income and white neighborhoods. The civil rights lawyer sums it all up this way. Segregated neighborhoods of color always end up getting all of the bad stuff and never their fair share of the good stuff. The second root cause is the involuntary displacement of poor people of color from their neighborhoods. Whether it's a highway project in which the government takes away people's homes, or the gradual gentrification of a poor neighborhood, well, the effect is the same: involuntary displacement of people. When things start to improve in a neighborhood and it starts to become a place where stores and services and public facilities are coming, then high-income people want to live there. And then gentrification and displacement really starts taking off. The third root cause of injustice is the unequal treatment of neighborhoods of color by our government. Remember that the first root cause was that racial discrimination leads to segregated neighborhoods. Well, the combination of racial segregation with concentrations of households living with low incomes, so it's racial segregation, poor people of color, in concentrated neighborhoods where many of those folks have low incomes. Well, that means that government officials can calculate that it makes political sense for them to withhold the good stuff of government, that is, good schools that cost money, good streets that cost money, complete sidewalks that cost money, and drainage that keeps homes from flooding, which also costs money. They can afford to keep all of these away from high poverty areas and instead direct the good stuff to high-income white areas. In other words, what the city council saves by not spending money on good stuff in low-income neighborhoods of color just leaves them more money to spend to provide those good things in high-income white neighborhoods. This is something that's been going on for more than 100 years now. Every year, neighborhoods that are poor and racially segregated get a little worse as the city withholds the good stuff, until things get so bad that politicians declare that it's just too expensive for them to fix it, or they claim that the city doesn't have enough money to restore all of the things that they've withheld from the segregated neighborhoods. Finally, the Houston community leaders, when they looked at these problems, came up with a fourth root cause of injustice. People in power do not listen to or act on what people living with low incomes asks them for. And this is a self-reinforcing cycle. Because people in power refuse to listen to people in the community, many folks in the community figure there's no use in organizing to demand the good stuff they'll never get anyway from the city. The bottom line is that people become apathetic when they don't get listened to. So these are the four root causes of injustice the community leaders in Houston came up with. Number 1, housing discrimination and segregation. Number 2, involuntary displacement from neighborhoods. 3, unequal treatment of neighborhoods of color by the city government. Number 4, officials don't listen to the people, and therefore the people give up. But are these four root causes really behind all the injustices we see in our homes and neighborhoods?
We've seen that injustices that are seen on the community and the housing level can be attributed to root causes. And there's 4 of those root causes. Let's take a look specifically at how this works. And let me, in the process, expand a little bit on how these injustices are linked to some of the root causes. This table has 4 columns in color, 1 for each of the 4 root causes. The pink area is root cause number 1, which is housing segregation and discrimination. The gray column next to it is displacement and gentrification. The yellow column shows root cause number 3, which is that neighborhoods of color are treated unequally. And root cause number 4 is government doesn't listen to the community. And then in the white area next to those 4 columns, I've listed out all of the injustices that the top leaders in Houston, the community development, the community grassroots leaders in the city, came up with as injustices that they saw in their communities and in their lives. So let's go through this process and put a few of these injustices under their root causes and explore how they're related. Let's start down here with flooding. Well, flooding is certainly an example of something that's caused when a city does not treat a neighborhood of color equally. The failure of the city to provide infrastructure, drainage infrastructure, storm sewers, and the like causes flooding at the neighborhood level. Community apathy. We talked a little earlier in the lesson about the fact that when government doesn't listen, people get discouraged, and that leads to apathy and a lack of civic engagement on people's part. Home loan redlining, the situation where banks refuse to lend so people can buy homes and get home repairs. Well, that's certainly an example of housing discrimination. Land speculators. Well, we see land speculators coming around and contributing to displacement and gentrification. Not enough sidewalks in a neighborhood. Well, that's certainly another example of the government not providing equal level of services to neighborhoods of color. The absence of quality stores. Well, that could go under a couple of categories, but I usually think of that as having to do with housing segregation and discrimination. Because when poor people are concentrated in a particular area, businesses don't naturally go toward that area. In other words, they look for where there's buying power, they look where there's people with more money. And if all the poor people are concentrated in a certain area, then businesses make a decision not to locate in those areas. NIMBY, or not in my backyard. Well, that certainly produces harm to individuals because it prevents affordable housing from being built in neighborhoods where people are opposed to it. And by and large, those are middle class and often white neighborhoods. And that is a manifestation of discrimination and produces housing segregation. Environmental hazards. Well, I think we could put that one easily under neighborhoods of color treated unequally, but I'm going to go ahead again and put it over under the issue of the root cause number one, which is housing segregation and discrimination. Because when you have segregated neighborhoods where you have lots of poor people located in a concentrated area, and when you have lots of poor people of color in particular located in a concentrated area, it's easier for government to get away with the idea of allowing businesses and commercial industries to locate in those neighborhoods. And similarly, if we think about low-performing schools, the school performance is directly tied to socioeconomic status in many cases. And where we have housing segregation and we have lots of concentration of poverty, we have lots of concentration of low socioeconomic students, poor kids. And when schools have a disproportionate number or percentage of poor children in the school, it lowers the performance levels of the school, which in turn makes people less willing to move into those areas. Illegal dumping. Well, I think that's clearly one where neighborhoods of color are treated unequally. You can think about the fact that the city just doesn't enforce the laws about dumping in those neighborhoods. And similarly, when the streets aren't maintained and where you have deteriorated streets and the city doesn't keep them up, that's a manifestation of the fact that the government is not treating the neighborhood where those streets are located in equally. Landlords mistreating tenants. Well, I think that, to me, that one also goes under root cause number one, the issue of housing segregation and discrimination. And that's because the landlords get away with maintaining slum property conditions in their properties because the city's not enforcing code standards. So in one sense, we could put that under neighborhoods of color are treated unequally. We could also say that that happens because there's concentrated poverty in certain areas of town, and the city basically writes those neighborhoods off and doesn't enforce the building standards there. So on second thought, I think let's go ahead and put that one under this category here. Neighborhoods of color are treated unequally. Homelessness. I think there's no doubt that people become homeless because housing is not available, and a secondary cause would be displacement. So if the affordable housing stock's being removed from area, then people can't afford housing in those areas and they're displaced, and a lot of folks end up becoming homeless. Barriers for people with disabilities. So I think I would also put that one under housing segregation and discrimination, because in essence, the decision to ignore the needs of people who are disabled is a direct example of housing discrimination. Bad and dangerous apartments. Once again, this could go into the category of neighborhoods of color are treated unequally. It could also go into, arguably, the root causes is housing segregation and discrimination. Abandoned buildings or homes. So once again, I think that's an example of neighborhoods of color are treated unequally because building standards aren't enforced, because the city doesn't invest in particular neighborhoods in terms of housing assistance programs and the like. That leads to building abandonment and homes that deteriorate where people can't live there. The shortage of affordable homes I would attribute to housing segregation and discrimination. And this is certainly a central issue for a lot of folks and a major problem in all of our communities. Housing discrimination, of course, when people are actually turning people down because of their race or their income, or they have children, or their disability status or their ethnicity, that clearly falls under the root cause number one, as does substandard housing. The prevalence of slumlords in an area is closely related to substandard housing, and I would also put it here. And the reason why I'm putting substandard housing and slumlords and the shortage of affordable homes under segregation and discrimination is that the city basically ends up writing off these neighborhoods, and they're able to do that because of the political powerlessness of the people who live in the neighborhoods, and that's because of concentrated poverty, and to some extent it's because of racist practices on the part of local governments where they ignore neighborhoods that have large shares of people of color. City ignores neighborhood needs. Well, of course, that's an example of the root cause number 4, where the government doesn't listen to the community. As I would say, is public housing authority mismanagement. And there's a lot of public housing authorities which don't do a good job of providing assistance or properly treating tenants and the like. And that the public housing authorities are themselves government entities. So if they're not listening to the tenants, if they're not listening to what the tenants are experiencing and saying to them, then they end up mismanaging those apartments. Inadequate public transit. Well, I think we could definitely put that one under neighborhoods of color treated unequally. We could also arguably, again, put that under housing discrimination, or because in essence it is lower income people and disproportionately people of color who depend on public transportation, especially low income people. And if the government doesn't care about the needs of low income people, then that's a discriminatory act and they wouldn't provide adequate transportation. But often the inadequate transportation is about how it doesn't adequately serve the needs of low-income communities of color. So I'm going to put that one under root number 3. As I am the example of building codes being unenforced in the area, and again, I think that could easily also go under root cause number 1. No grocery stores. Well, once again, that's a lot like the earlier issue we had here, which is the lack of commercial development and good stores and things like that. And many areas that are neighborhoods of concentrated poverty, don't have access to grocery stores. They're food deserts. And that's because these are segregated, high poverty neighborhoods. Limited opportunities for people to move up in the housing market. In other words, you have a house in an area, but you need a bigger house, or you want to stay in the community, but you can't find a good house to move up into, a little bigger house or a little better house. Well, those problems are also attributed to the fact that segregated neighborhoods don't attract a robust building market on the part of home builders. Displacement and gentrification, well, that's the name of number 2, and I put it again down here again because that's such a big concern of whole lot of folks. Another cause of displacement and gentrification is evictions. And we know that when evictions are up, especially in particular neighborhoods, it can devastate an area. And then finally, bad zoning. And again, that's an example of where the city is being insensitive to the conditions that exist within neighborhoods of color. So I hope in going through this exercise, we've begun to see a little more clearly how all of those injustices that we identified in Lesson 1 can be attributed back to one of these 4 root causes, and in some cases, to more than one of the 4 root causes.
That's it for part 2 of this course. In this lesson, we explored the 4 root causes of inequality that create the many injustices we experience in our homes and neighborhoods. To complete this part of the course, there's one final assignment for you. When you've completed that assignment, you can move on to the 3rd and final part of the course, where we will come up with a way to attack the 4 roots of injustice. See you in part 3.